everyone deserves access to information. Really, they do. Whether that's in your target language, first language, whether that's in an accessible format, everyone has a right to accessing what they need to live a life. This perspective of both language learning, language acquisition, as well as disability, they're so intertwined, and I think it's now more important than ever.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Kate Sonka joins us to share the work and vision of the tech accessibility nonprofit Teach Access.
Hello, Speaking of Language listeners. Angelica and Sam here. We are delighted to bring you a new season, number 15, of conversations around all things language learning and teaching. And what better way to start this year by highlighting the importance of access and accessibility in education.
We have Kate Sonka with us today, Executive Director of Teach Access, a nonprofit working to bridge the accessibility skills gap between education and industry. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Kate.
Oh, thank you both. I'm just so glad to be here. It's just lovely to see you again, Angelica. Sam, great to meet you. Just great.
I know. Well, Kate, we are super pumped to hear all about this venture that you find yourself in. But before we dive into that, can you please share with our listeners a little bit more about you, your background, and also your path with languages?
Happy to. So, I've always loved languages, always been a lover of languages, and as an undergrad, my major was actually Spanish and Latin American and Caribbean studies. And during that time, was able to do 2 study abroad programs, one to Spain, one to Peru. And from there, just continued to try and learn when and where I could more languages.
Nice.
And so, yeah, it's just always been a thing that has been a part of the work that I do. And then I have a master's degree in bilingual bicultural education.
Cool.
And the focus was was really how do we create inclusive learning spaces for language learners in the classroom. The program itself was more focused K-12, but I always knew that my destiny in education, if you will, was with adult learners or university level. So, it's just really carried through for my academic and professional life.
Yeah, awesome. That's what we like to hear.
Absolutely. So we'll dive into the main portion of our conversation by starting small. Tell us everything about Teach Access.
Just casual.
Yeah.
Start the timer.
How did this amazing nonprofit come about? What do you and your team do? How did you find your way to Teach Access?
Really, really great question. So I'll start with what we do and then how did I get there and how does it tie to language? So the work that we do, we were founded actually in 2016, and we came together as a group of volunteers. And so this was born out of conversations that the tech industry was having really with each other, where they were saying, you know what, when we hire recent graduates from university and colleges, and they're in our buildings going through orientation, and we as the accessibility team come and talk to them and ask, do you know what this is? Few to none of them were raising their hand, which means they weren't learning about it when they were in university, and it isn't required still. It's not a required topic. And so they said, how do we start to address this? And so it became a huge collaborative effort. They reached out to colleagues and friends and researchers in academia and higher ed. And then, of course, colleagues, partners, collaborators, whatever word you'd like to use, in other areas as well. So disability advocacy groups, accessibility organizations, and so forth. And came together and really said, let's try and close what we call this accessible technology skills gap. This idea that industry is looking for this knowledge and they cannot find enough students or recent graduates who know. And so that's how it started. And it was totally one of those, I think there was 40 of us at the kickoff meeting. Let's just get in a room and see what happens. Is
Yeah.
this a thing? Do we do something with this?
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? It's now 2025 and it's still a thing. And actually in 2021, we became an actual 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means we now have a full-time staff, which of course can move things along at a different pace.
Sure.
We still absolutely rely on volunteers and can't do it without volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
But any of you out there who volunteer, you know that it's not your primary
Mm-hmm.
thing. So it just
Sure.
moves at a different pace than when we have full-time dedicated staff. So um, I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more about all of the programs and so forth. But really our mission has remained, how do we get more students learning about accessibility and disability so that as they go out into whatever job they're going to have, they know that they need to create inclusive technology products, services from the beginning. And so we do that through various programs, activities to support educators and faculty, and then some as well direct to students to just help people be teaching and learning about this topic. And so one last thing before I pause, the reason that I'm so interested in it, and you're like, okay, but you were a language person, really what it comes down to is I've always been extremely passionate and dedicated to creating inclusive
Mm-hmm.
teaching and learning environments.
Yeah.
And it happened that early on, for me, that was language. That's how I sort of entered into this space. It made sense. We have language learners in our classrooms, potentially, English language learners, depending
Sure.
if we're talking about being here in the US or wherever. But then it became, okay, but also what about all of our students with disabilities? How are we creating inclusive spaces there? And as I'm sure we'll get to, there's some overlap there in the ways that accessibility can help language learners. So
Oh,
for
absolutely.
me, that's how it all kind of still works together in my mind.
Wonderful. That's great. So speaking about this skills gap, this accessibility skills gap, your team created a survey to actually really find out, like, what does this gap look like, and then how do you build those bridges? Can you talk a little bit more about that? What did the survey find, and what is the solution or a potential solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was an earlier survey done, I think it was in 2018. So this was, if you're remembering, 2016 is when we kicked off. So just a couple years after, there were a few of us collaborating uh, to try and identify some of this data. And so yes, basically it was, yes, there's an accessibility skills gap. And so we refreshed it. Again, it would have been in 2022 now, and we published it in 23, if I'm remembering my dates off the top of my head correctly. And what it was doing, or what we did, is surveyed kind of a larger group than the first time. So it did include absolutely industry, but it also included higher ed. It included other types of industries and people who are in hiring positions. And it really was just sort of asking, hey, is accessibility important to your company, to your organization? If so, can you find enough employees, if you will, recent graduates who know about it? And the answer is still no. We can't find enough, and yes, demand is increasing for that. And so we published that as a white paper. It's available on our website, teachaccess.org. And so you can see a little bit more about maybe who was responding and some of those findings. And really what our recommendations were coming out of there is that you should start somewhere. Start from where you are. Start to sort of lay that groundwork where you can. Train up your current staff. Figure out how do we start to include this more into our hiring practices,
Right.
so that as we're bringing in new people to the organization, we're placing value on, hey, you know something about accessibility. You don't have to be an expert, but you know something.
Fantastic. Who are your partners at Teach Access?
Great question. So we have a lot. So I probably will not list them all because that would be the entire episode here. But I think that speaks to the actual interest and genuine care that people have in this space. So when we think about our partners, we absolutely have corporate sponsors who are providing funding as
Mm-hmm.
well as their time in various ways to volunteer and support our efforts. We really were born out of the tech industry. So that kickoff meeting we had in 2016 was actually held at the Yahoo headquarters when they were in their previous location. And we had people from big tech there. And since then, we've expanded into other industries as well, and others are coming to the table. We have some financial tech organizations, we have health, and so forth. So we definitely have industry in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then for our educational institutions, I think the last time we did a quick look, we have more than 300
Oh,
that
wow.
have in some way interacted with us
Mm-hmm.
to varying levels. It could be that they're participating in our programming, or they're accessing our materials, or they're volunteering to help us create some of these things. And then, of course, anyone who works in the disability space is
Mm-hmm.
familiar with the phrase "nothing about us without us." And so there's no way we would be doing this work or should be doing this work if we didn't have active and equal participation from people with disabilities. That absolutely, those are individuals who are in industry, who are in higher ed, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but also some of those disability advocacy and other types of nonprofits who are focused on advocacy for various disability communities. They're a part of our work. And then we have over time, in different ways, also had government involved in what we're doing um, at federal level,
Mm-hmm.
at the federal level, and some local and state level. So that has been a thing that's happened. We'll see where things go as we move forward. But
Yeah.
yeah, really, all of that to say, a very collaborative
Mm-hmm.
effort
Mm-hmm.
of people who care about this.
Yeah, that's awesome. Tell us a little bit more about the programming. So you just laid out all the partners and stakeholders, and of course, you offer different types of programs and resources for all these people, or individuals, or corporations, or whatever institutions. But I think you do a lot with students specifically, right? So if you can give us a brief overview of some of the programs, and maybe also from your perspective, what's the most impactful program?
Yes, so I love this question because I think my approach over time has shifted a little bit in that when we were first getting started, it was very much like students. That's our end goal, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
get students to learn, get students to graduate and get out there and
Mm-hmm.
be those inclusive designers and programmers and developers and whatever they might be doing. And that is still so true. But as we've been able to grow and think about our scale and our reach, really the most powerful place for us to be is working with faculty. Because as all of you out there know who work in education, who teach, you're teaching every semester, every term. You have a new group of students every semester. So if we're able to reach you as a faculty member and support you in figuring out, how do I start to teach this in my class? How do I introduce this to my student? Then every term, ideally, hopefully, you're continuing to do that, and so you're reaching more and more students. Versus if we were only focused on reaching students, we've
Mm-hmm.
reached one student, we've reached one student.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so our programming over time has um, if I have to put a percent around it, I'd probably say about 80% of our efforts in terms of programming and resources are designed for faculty, with faculty, to support faculty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And 20% is direct for students.
Interesting.
Because it's still important to us to know what drives students, what are they interested in, what do they
Sure.
care about, being able to make connections for students with industry to help them build their network. But yeah, for faculty, so we have something called a student academy, where students are able to learn directly from industry, hear directly from industry what's happening with accessibility in those organizations. For faculty, we have a variety of stuff. We have a faculty fellowship program, which is a year-long program where they work with us, and we take them from here's what these topics are to here's how you could start to put them into your own courses, to great, and now how about you be an advocate as well and join us in
Nice.
this work.
Yeah, great.
And there is a stipend provided there. Everything we do, I always need to be clear about this, is free. Free, no charge, no cost. Use our stuff. And where we can, we provide stipends as well to honor people's time. We also have some other programs that I can talk about, but I'll skip to kind of the resources that are the big ones.
Yeah.
We have something called the Teach Access Curriculum Repository. So this is a free OER, Open Educational Resource Repository. It's under a Creative Commons license. So faculty are able to go into this repository, find materials, individual curricular items that you could use in your own course. So these could be things like sample syllabi. If you're like, how would I fit this into my class? I'd love to see an example. It could be slide decks. It could be lecture material. It could be student projects, assessments,
Nice.
etc. It's not sort of a start to finish complete curriculum. That's not the idea. We really want it to be infused across as many courses as possible. So it's a real pick and choose situation. But right now we have more than 350 items divided around different disciplines, including interdisciplinary. We have some technical writing, some other things in there, as well as computer science, programming, etc. So that's a big one. That's free, that's open, you can go find it. And then we also have our self-paced accessibility courses. So if you're someone who's like, I'm kind of interested, but I'd like to know more before I feel comfortable feeling ready to teach. You can go in, I think we have just over a dozen or 12 or 13 courses in there designed specifically as with faculty as the audience for them to go in and say, what does accessibility and disability look like in my discipline? And then that will hopefully and does prompt them to think about, here's how I could fit this into my course. Also free, self-paced, online, and so forth.
Yeah, nice.
Well, before we go any further, we'd like to take a moment and have you read parts of Teach Access's diversity, equity, and inclusion statement.
Yes, happy to. So we have this proudly on our website, so you can read that there, find out more about what we do, but I'll read the first part of it. So this is under our DEI statement, Technology for All. Teach Access envisions a future where technology is born accessible and inclusive for all. When we say all, we mean all. We know that to realize our vision, we must have a relentless commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in all that we do. This commitment means that we are consistently evaluating and challenging systems, practices, and behaviors that uphold oppression, such as ableism, racism, sexism, classism, ageism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, and others. Our approach at Teach Access has always been to form and maintain key partnerships to include, collaborate, and bring visibility to the voices and work of historically underserved communities that are disproportionately impacted by the lack of accessible and inclusive technology. We hold ourselves accountable for showing up to our work in a way that contributes to the collective prosperity for all.
Thank you.
That gives me the chills. I have to say that. Yep. Everybody needs to live by this statement.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Even when we, sometimes we falter, but we keep going
Yeah.
and we keep this as our this is what we're doing. This is what we believe, and yeah.
Yep.
Well, it might be worth repeating this to follow that up. Why are programs and resources that help students and educators learn the fundamentals of disability and accessibility so important?
Yeah, I think everyone deserves access to information.
Yeah.
Really, they do. Whether that's in, your target language, first language, whether that's in an accessible format. Everyone deserves and has a right to accessing what they need to live a life. And so, for me, like I said, being able to kind of have this perspective of both language learning, language acquisition, as well as disability, they're so intertwined, they're super intersectional, but it's so important that we're able to have access to what we need, and I think it's now more important than ever. I think especially when there are systems in place that are um, created in a way that excludes various populations. I mean, that's my life's work. That's our work, right? To break those systems down, or find ways to work within them, around them, whatever that might be, because we have to. I mean,
Right.
that we have to.
Mm-hmm.
It's how we care for our communities, whether those are people we actually know personally or just broadly as humanity. I mean, we have to care for each other.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes.
what else is
Yes.
there, you know?
Yes. Hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kate, you've already talked a little bit about language specifically, but if we consider language education and the work that you do, what are some of the things that our colleagues and our students should consider and do to advocate for accessibility? And I do want to point out one of the first things, of course, that they all need to do, that everybody has to do, is play a round of your accessibility trivia that's posted on your website.
Yes, thank you. That is a fun, just learn some facts. There are some
Yay.
things in there you're like, wow, really? Wait, what? That was because of
Mm,
an accommodation or
mm,
its accessibility or assistive technology. I really think one thing that's important for, especially folks working in um, language fields, is considering the ways that we all learn languages,
mm,
and that there is overlap between that and things that we know work for learners with disabilities, faculty with disabilities, staff, our
right.
colleagues. And some of this might sound familiar, perhaps, but I don't know about you, but there are certain shows that I watch where either it's in a different language
Mm-hmm.
that's not a language that I speak, or whatever it might be, and I put on the captions, and
Mm-hmm.
that is super helpful. Um, or listening to album Bad Bunny. I don't know if anyone is a
Oh.
fan out there. His
Mhm.
new album is incredible, and I have been listening to it while reading the lyrics. Incredibly helpful for me, because it really helps me understand what he's saying, and what's happening. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the things that helps us with language acquisition. But there are also ways that helps and
Right.
is designed for people with disabilities to access that information. And so I think considering things that we can do for our language learners thereby extends into our learners with disabilities. So some of those accessible teaching practices are super crucial. But yeah, things like playing accessibility trivia,
Mm-hmm.
a big one for me that I always tell students is if you have a social media presence or are on social media, follow disabled content creators. There is
Mhm.
not a better way to learn
Mm-hmm.
about um, everything related to disability than following actual disabled people,
Yeah.
talking about their lives. What is it? And the work that they do. And it's not always about only disability, but it's just broadening that perspective to understand
Yeah.
the various ways people exist in the world. And so that's a big one. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
really, really great content creators out there sharing about the work that they do or who they are. And that's really helpful, really informative.
What kind of change have you seen as a result of the work Teach Access does?
Yeah, this is a great question. There are some ways we've seen, and then some ways that I'm like, I don't know if we'll ever see, right? Like that's it.
Sure.
Who's to say? But we definitely, I mean, I have seen the conversation shift over the years, especially in higher ed and faculty we work with. There was a time in the previous institution I worked at where it was really just like, "Hey, here's this. Can we talk about it?" And it was like, "I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what that is, or I don't really know. Do I need to do something with accessibility?" And I really don't have a lot of those conversations as much anymore. I'm sure they're still happening, but we certainly are to a space where it's, yeah, okay, how do I start to approach this? How do I do this? And then being able to have those resources, we've really seen such a great groundswell, if you will, or an increase in faculty and educators in higher ed, finding ways. to include accessibility in their curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have various data points that we can toss out there, but by one calculation, we believe we've reached potentially more than 900,000 students
Oh, wow.
since we started,
Wow.
and that can be different, right? Either they were directly reached or
Mm-hmm.
impacted by our programming, or they were in a classroom taught
Mm-hmm.
by a faculty member who got a stipend from us. So there's varying degrees of that, but I really just like to hold on to that number and imagine there's potentially that many students out there, or now graduates, depending, who at least know about accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean they're experts. That's not our goal. But what is that impact that they're out there potentially being the one at the table saying, wow,
Right.
this app sounds so cool.
Mm-hmm.
How do we make it accessible? We need to do that. So yeah, that to me is
Yeah,
another one I like to hold on to.
absolutely. Yeah. What are some of your future plans?
Great question. So, we have mostly been operating in higher education since we started. We actually just laid out our next 3-year strategic plan. We're on day, first month of that in this
Mm-hmm.
first year. And so, some of the ways that we're looking at expansion is in K to 12 education settings in the
Nice.
US. We have a lot to learn there. So, if any of you out there in those spaces, reach out because we would love to learn from you. So K to 12 is one space. And then the other that we're also excited about is actually expanding globally.
Mm-hmm.
So we have always, like I said, our materials have always been free and always been available to anyone, anywhere. But we're really taking some intentional steps to understand what does it mean to support this work in other places. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're kind of zeroing in on a few locations. We have the UK, Europe. We're looking at Kenya and also Brazil as
Cool.
starting points to just understand
Nice.
how do we bring a coalition like this together in those
Mm-hmm.
various locations? How do we support it? What does it look like? So those are two that I'm really excited about because those are really,
Yeah.
expansion plans
Yep.
for us and what we're trying to do.
That's great.
What are some ways for our listeners to get involved in the work you all do?
Oh, I love that question. Well, certainly, please take a look at the resources we have, use them, share them. We have a variety of resources I didn't even mention that are useful in the ways that could be, how do I even get started in this? Or why should I teach accessibility? Or what's a list of things I could teach if I wanted to? So definitely taking a look at those and sharing with others. So if there are people where you're like, hey, you might be interested in this, let them know.
Mm.
And then we will have and do have throughout the year various moments when we're looking for volunteers to help with different projects, different programs. It might be helping us design a program or a resource or something to that effect. So there's always those sorts of opportunities. You can find us on some social media channel. We're
Mm-hmm.
on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook right now. And then we also have a monthly newsletter, so you could sign up for that if you're like, I just kind of want to hear what you're
Mm-hmm.
up to for a little bit before I know what to do. That's also a good way to understand what we have going and where we're at.
And you're way too humble. Donate.
Yes,
Throw all
and
your money at Teach
thank
Access,
you,
people.
Angelica. That is so. Yes, I mean, as with all nonprofits, that is
Yes.
incredibly helpful for us as well. Any any size donation absolutely makes an impact for us. So yeah, there we absolutely appreciate that. And depending on where you're working, if you have an organization that looks to support
Mm.
initiatives like this, we also find ways to partner in various ways. Not always financial or
Sure.
sponsorship, but also if you're trying to do something with some faculty on your campus and you're like, we'd love for someone from Teach Access to come and talk, happy to reach out. We're happy to do that.
Awesome.
Great.
Now, Kate, this is not related directly to your accessibility work, but I know that you are an aficionado of, wait for it, people, hot dogs.
It's true.
How did you end up being a hot dog connoisseur, and where in the world can one find the best hot dog, according to Kate Sonka?
Wow. Okay, so I don't know how it happened. I think I just, it's one of those things where I'm like, wow, I really like them. And then I'm like, I really like them. And then it became a thing that I enjoyed trying everywhere I go across the US, across the world, because everyone does them differently,
Yeah.
And I'm going to be honest, I genuinely like whatever hot dog I'm eating.
Yeah,
So
fair.
I know that feels like a cop-out answer,
Nope.
but I swear
No.
to you, it is not. I genuinely find value in any hot dog, any way someone wants to prepare it. Because as with all food, we know this as humans, food really is an expression of where you are. And so I have had some interesting ones where I'm like, wow, but I can see why that would be made that way. So yeah, I love them all. The
Fair.
$1.50 soda hot dog combo at Costco, you can't
Oh,
beat
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But then you want to go get a gourmet hot dog somewhere else, like, okay, let's go. Yeah.
I really appreciate, and honestly, I'm thrilled that your values around diversity and inclusion extend to hot dogs. I really,
You know what, Sam? That is the thing. I'm like, I don't want to single out anyone as being better or worse than any all hot dogs are delicious.
it's a whole, yeah. All there's a slogan or a T-shirt in there
Yes.
somewhere. Yeah,
Yes.
I love it.
All hot
Perfect.
dogs are valid.
Yeah.
Like
There we go.
yeah.
Oh man. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Before we sign off, Kate, we'd like to ask you for a word in a language you love, are learning, want to learn, that makes you feel good. We all need that right now.
Yes,
What
we
do you
do.
got?
This has been my favorite word since I learned it, probably in middle school or high school. It's the Spanish word for meatball, albóndiga. It makes me feel so good to say it, and I love eating them, and I just love how the word looks, and it feels in my mouth when I say it. Albóndiga is to me my favorite word. It really is.
It sounds delicious. I like that.
You know?
That
Yeah.
is good stuff.
Yeah, it is.
Awesome.
What are yours?
Oh wow! Now you're totally
I'm-
catching
on
us off
us.
guard
I know I'm
here.
totally turning the tables,
No,
but
I
I'm curious if
like
you have
it.
one.
Oh, there are so many, and
I
I can't even remember. We did, when we started asking this question, we did disclose ours, and I would actually have to look back at our show notes, Sam,
Yeah, I know.
to see what I claimed back then.
All right,
Yeah.
I know. I've said saucisson, which
Right.
was for salami in French, which is I think that was a word that feels good to say, or I forget which variant it was, but it does apply. But there are a lot of. I mean, I love words, so I'm trying to think of a good one that just like.
Yeah, I think right now, and I may have said this before, I can't remember, but Zuckerwatte, which is cotton candy. Zuckerwatte.
I
a good
like
one.
that one. That sounds so good.
Yeah.
I find a lot of them are related to food. Isn't that interesting? For a lot of people too, right?
Well, it's comfort, right?
It is. You're
And
so
we
right.
need comfort all the time.
We do.
Well, Kate, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for the important work that you do, for the impact that you and your team have. And also, thank you so much for speaking of language with us today.
Yes, thank you both. It was absolutely delightful. Appreciate it.
Join us next week to hear about two student organizations that are now officially part of the Language Resource Center. The Language Expansion Program and the Translator-Interpreter Program have great things in store for our community.
If you are on campus, you can always meet them at Clubfest this Sunday, February 2nd in Barton Hall.
Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners. And do stay tuned for our next episode.